My mother and her boyfriend threatened to cut ties with me unless I made my half-brother a business partner. So, I stopped covering her mortgage and car payments, and now they're pleading with me. All right, Reddit, this is going to be a long one, but I need to get it off my chest. Let me give you some background first. I'm a 43-year-old man, and I grew up in circumstances worse than you can probably imagine. I'm not looking for sympathy, just want you to understand how this whole situation began. So, my mom had me when she was just 15. Yes, you read that right. My father? Complete waste of space. The second he found out she was expecting, he vanished. Never met him, don't even know his name, and honestly, I don't care. My mom's parents were the ultra-religious type who prioritized their church image over their own daughter, so they kicked her out. Real godly behavior, right? We ended up in run-down apartments, the kind where even the cockroaches gave you weird looks. We were constantly moving because we couldn't afford rent, sometimes crashing with my mom's friends, who weren't much better off than us. There were winters without heating. I remember bundling up in every piece of clothing I had, piling on 3 blankets, and still shivering. The electricity got shut off a lot, too. Ever tried doing homework by candlelight? Not fun. Mom worked any job she could find, but who wants to hire a teenage dropout with a kid? Mostly, she waitressed and cleaned houses, stuff like that. Sometimes she juggled 2 or 3 jobs at once, but it was never enough. We relied on food stamps, but they never lasted the full month. That last week was always either instant noodles or nothing at all. When I was about 8, this guy named Ray started hanging around. Mom met him at the diner where she worked. Looking back, I can see what a complete loser he was, but I guess she was desperate for someone to help out. He moved in barely a month after they met, and things got even worse. Ray was one of those guys who seemed nice at first, then showed his true colors once he was settled in. He'd push my mom around, not full-blown hitting, at least not that I saw, but grabbing her arms, shoving her against walls, that kind of thing. Whenever I tried to stand up for her, being a dumb kid thinking I could do anything, he'd get in my face, threatening to teach me respect if I didn't shut up. The worst part? He drained her financially. The moment she cashed her paycheck, his hand was out, claiming it was for rent and bills. Yet somehow rent was always overdue, while he somehow always had money for himself. I'd see him downtown spending cash while we barely had anything to eat at home. This went on for about 3 years, and it still makes me furious to think about. My mom made excuses for him, saying he was doing his best or that things were hard for everyone. Then one day, he just didn't come back. Found out later he had moved in with some other woman he'd been seeing. Mom was a wreck for a while, but honestly, life was better without him. We were still struggling, like really struggling, but at least the little money she earned actually went toward rent and food instead of whatever Ray wanted. She dated other men after him, but none stuck around for long, probably because once they saw we had nothing, they bailed. Around 12 or 13, I started noticing how other kids lived, really noticing. They had actual houses, their own bedrooms, new clothes that actually fit, instead of secondhand stuff from Goodwill. They could buy lunch at school while I was on the free meal program. Super embarrassing, by the way, because everyone knew. That's when I started getting really angry. Not at my mom exactly, since she was doing her best, but just at everything. Why did we have to live like this? Why couldn't we have normal things like everyone else? I began doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, whatever I could find. It wasn't much money, but at least I could buy my own school supplies and, on occasion, food when we ran out at home. But the worst part of being that poor isn't just the lack of food, the terrible apartments, or the constant stress. It's the feeling of being trapped, like this is just how your life will always be. You see other people living normally, and it feels like something out of a TV show. Not real, not something you could ever have. By the time I turned 17, I was done. Completely done. I refused to be poor any longer. I started taking on every job I could get my hands on, literally anything. Gas stations, fast food, unloading trucks, cleaning offices at night. If someone was paying, I was working. At one point, I was holding down 4 jobs at once. Mornings at McDonald's, Afternoons at a warehouse, evenings at a gas station, and overnight cleaning offices. I barely slept, but I didn't care. I was making about $800 a week, which was more money than I had ever seen in my life. My mom thought I was crazy for working that much. She kept telling me I needed to slow down and enjoy my youth, but what exactly was there to enjoy? Being hungry? Living with no electricity? No thanks. I was done with all of that. Anyway, one of the jobs I had was at a local business that specialized in selling restaurant supplies. The owner, Jay, was always there, literally from the moment the doors opened until closing most days. At first, I assumed he was just one of those overbearing bosses who constantly monitored employees, but that wasn't the case at all. I remember this one time when I was organizing a storage room way in the back. Hardly anyone ever went back there, and most of my coworkers used it as an excuse to slack off. But I actually put in the effort to arrange everything properly and make it more efficient. Jay walked in and just stood there watching me. For a moment, I thought I was in trouble, but instead he said, "You're different from the other kids who work here." Then he started asking me questions about how I was organizing everything and why I was doing it that way. We ended up having a conversation about inventory management and efficiency for almost an hour. Definitely not a typical chat for a teenager. But I guess he saw something in me. From that point on, he started teaching me about the business, not just the usual employee tasks, but real business knowledge. He even showed me the company's financial records, which, looking back, is crazy. Who shares their financials with a random 17-year-old employee? He explained how he made purchasing choices and even let me sit in on meetings with suppliers. Later, I found out that Jay had also grown up poor, maybe not as badly off as I had been, but he definitely understood what it meant to go hungry. I think that's why he took an interest in me. He had built his business from nothing, starting with selling supplies out of his garage and growing it into a legitimate company over 2 decades. Other employees would give me a hard time for being Jay's favorite and call me a suck-up, but I didn't care. For the first time in my life, someone was actually teaching me something useful. School had always felt like something I just had to get through, but this was practical, real-world knowledge. And Jay didn't just teach me about running a business. He taught me all sorts of other things too. He showed me how to dress for professional settings, took me to buy my first proper suit, and even taught me how to talk to important people. He'd bring me along to business lunches and even showed me things like table manners. That might sound silly, but when you grow up the way I did, nobody teaches you that stuff. The biggest lesson Jay gave me, though, was that escaping poverty was actually possible. Not just scraping by, but truly getting out. Before him, I thought the best I could hope for was making just enough to afford a slightly better apartment and keep the lights on. But he showed me that there was so much more than that. I started staying late after my shifts, asking him questions about everything, and he always answered them patiently. He never made me feel like I was a nuisance. The only time Jay ever got upset with me was when I skipped a shift because I was completely drained from working all my other jobs. He pulled me into his office and told me something I'll never forget. Being poor is exhausting, I know, but if you want to own a business one day, hard work isn't enough. You have to be dependable. If you commit to being somewhere, you show up. After that, I never missed another shift, no matter how exhausted or sick I was. Eventually, I started dropping my other jobs one by one so I could work more hours at Jay's. I was making less money overall, but I was learning so much more. I ended up working at Jay's business for about 3 years, soaking up everything I could. The entire time, I kept thinking about starting my own business. Not copying Jay's, of course. That would have been wrong after everything he had done for me. But I had this idea that just wouldn't go away. You know those high-end meal kit delivery services that exist now, where they send you ingredients and recipes? Well, this was before any of that existed, and my idea was something similar but for restaurants. I wanted to provide restaurants with pre-measured ingredients they'd need for the next day, making it easier for them to manage their inventory. Working with Jay, I noticed that smaller restaurants constantly struggled with stock and often had to make last-minute supply runs. I spent about 6 months developing a business plan. Jay had taught me how to create one, and he helped me refine it, making me really think through every detail. After about 20 revisions, Jay finally told me he wanted to invest in my idea. I couldn't believe it. The man who had taught me everything actually trusted me enough to put his own money into my vision. But he didn't just hand me a check, he made me take out loans as well. He said I needed to have personal stakes in the business to feel the risk. Do you know how terrifying it is to sign a business loan when you grew up with nothing? My hands were literally shaking because all I could think was, if this fails, I'll be in debt for life. The first few months were brutal. I found a small warehouse I could afford. It was basically just a big garage with a walk-in fridge. I couldn't afford employees, so I was doing everything myself. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. to start prepping orders, deliver them until noon, spend the afternoon making sales calls to find new clients, and then do all the paperwork until midnight. I'd get a few hours of sleep, and then do it all over again. When I first launched, I only had 3 customers. They barely ordered anything, probably just took pity on me because I begged them to give my service a try. I lost money every single day for 6 months straight. There were moments when I'd sit alone in that empty warehouse, completely defeated, wanting to break down. But slowly, very slowly, things started turning around. One customer would recommend us to another. A restaurant would have an emergency, and we'd save the day with a last-minute delivery. Word spread that we were reliable. More orders started coming in, then bigger ones. After about a year, we finally had enough clients that I could afford to hire someone to help with deliveries. I still remember the first time I handed over the van keys to someone else. It felt strange to let someone else take over a part of what I had built. But it was a necessary step. 2 years in, we expanded to a second location in a neighboring city. That was terrifying, like starting over, but with even more pressure because now I had employees relying on me for their paychecks. But it worked. So, we opened another location, then another. Now, 2 decades later, we're operating in about 30 cities, with real warehouses, actual trucks, and hundreds of employees. But I still think about that first tiny warehouse and that beat-up van. I even keep a picture of it in my office as a reminder of where everything started. Jay passed away a few years ago. Cancer. It still hurts to think about. At his funeral, I found out he had helped a lot of other people start their own businesses too. Not all of them succeeded, but he always tried to help anyone willing to put in the effort and learn. I miss him every day. That's when Ben, 40, entered the picture. Let me tell you about my brother. Technically, he's my half-brother. We have different dads. His father was another guy who took off. He's 3 years younger than me, and since it was just the 2 of us, and Mom, we were close growing up. But even as kids, we were nothing alike. While I was always trying to figure out ways to make money or improve our situation, Ben just went with the flow, accepting that being broke was just the way life was. As we got older, our differences became even more obvious. While I was working multiple jobs to get ahead, Ben started hanging out with a bad crowd from the neighborhood. They weren't hardcore criminals or anything, but they stole from stores, broke into cars, just small-time trouble that wouldn't necessarily land them in jail, but was enough to guarantee they wouldn't go anywhere in life. I tried to talk to him about it, warned him over and over. Ben, you're going to get yourself locked up. Come work with me instead. But he'd just laugh and say I was too serious, that I needed to loosen up and enjoy life. Enjoy life? We grew up eating instant noodles for dinner most nights, and he wanted to talk about fun. When I first started working with Jay, I thought it was the perfect chance to help Ben turn things around. I still remember bringing him to the warehouse one day. Jay was great about it, treated him exactly like he treated me when we first met. He asked Ben about his goals, what he wanted to do, and even offered to teach him the business just like he taught me. You know what Ben said? He called Jay a stuck-up rich guy trying to act like a hero. I was so embarrassed. Jay just smiled and said it was fine, but I could tell he was disappointed. Not in Ben specifically, but in the fact that he couldn't help someone who didn't want to be helped. Years later, when my business was doing well and I was preparing to open a second location, I gave Ben another shot. I offered him a solid job managing deliveries, not an entry-level position, but a real leadership role with a good salary and benefits. Jay had warned me not to mix family with business, said it was a recipe for trouble, but I didn't listen. I was convinced I could help my brother build something for himself. Ben showed up for training exactly once. And the thing is, he was actually good at it. Like, really good. He's smart when he applies himself. He picked up the computer system fast, understood the delivery routes right away. He had a natural knack for it. But then, payday came around. We pay everyone bi-weekly, just like most companies. Pretty standard. But Ben stormed into my office, furious, demanding to know why he wasn't getting paid that day. I tried explaining how payroll cycles work, that he'd get paid on the same schedule as everyone else, but he wasn't having it. "I need money now," he said. "I got people waiting on me." I later found out he had borrowed money from some guys and promised to pay them back with his first paycheck, but he needed the cash that day, not in 2 weeks. After that, he never came back. Instead, he went back to a factory job where he got paid every Friday. That became the pattern. Every couple of years, whenever things got rough for him, he'd show up asking for work. I'd give him another chance, set him up with a good position, and within days, he'd vanish again. Sometimes he wouldn't even bother telling me he was quitting. He just wouldn't show up. Do you know how that made me look to my other employees? The owner's own brother disappearing from work with no explanation? The last time I tried was about 5 years ago. We had a management opening at one of our newer locations. Solid pay, easy responsibilities, mostly just overseeing inventory and supervising a small team. I told Ben he could work his way up from there, maybe even run his own location one day. That time, he lasted a full 2 weeks. Then I found out he was telling his employees they didn't need to follow company procedures, that they could just do things his way. When I pulled him aside to talk about it, he quit on the spot. Told me I was on a power trip, trying to control everything. After that, I stopped offering him jobs. I still helped him out financially when he needed it, but I was done trying to bring him into the business. And that hurt. I had built something real, something that could have helped him too, but you can't help someone who refuses to help themselves. Mom always made excuses for him. He's still figuring things out. He's on a different path than you. Not everyone wants to be a businessman. But this wasn't about running a business. It was about being a responsible adult. Ben is 40 now and still lives like he's 20. He bounces from one job to the next, always just one missed paycheck away from being broke. The worst part? He resents me for succeeding. Like, somehow me doing well made his life harder. He says I've changed since I made money, that I forgot where I came from. How could I forget where I came from when I spent so many years trying to help him escape it too? Anyway, last week, Mom called and asked me to come over. To the house I pay for, by the way, $2,800 mortgage every month, never missed a payment. I also cover her car loan, utilities, and on top of that, I send her about $2,000 extra each month for whatever she needs. Just giving you the numbers. So, just to be clear, I wasn't being stingy with my family or anything. Then I found out Ben had moved back in with Mom. No shock there. Every time he can't cover his rent, he always ends up back at her place. But this time, there was someone else living there too. Mike, Mom's new boyfriend. She had been seeing him for a few months, but never mentioned him to me. I walked in and saw Mike sitting in my dad's old recliner. Yeah, I still think of it as my dad's chair, even though the man was never around. But there Mike was, acting like he owned the place, giving me this smug look, like he knew something I didn't. Mom started with the usual speech about Ben having a tough time, losing his most recent job, and struggling to get by. I was just waiting for the part where she asked for money, because it's always about money. But this time, she threw something completely unexpected at me. She wanted me to make Ben and Mike partners in my business. I actually laughed, thinking it was some kind of joke. But no one else was laughing. That's when Mike started running his mouth about his so-called business experience. Apparently, he owned a phone repair shop about a decade ago that went under in less than a year. Real business genius, right? Then he started rambling about all these ideas he had for my company, claiming he could take it to the next level. Then Mom chimed in, saying the jobs I had previously given Ben were beneath him, that it was embarrassing for my own brother to be just a manager. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I built this business from absolutely nothing. I spent 2 decades growing it, and now they expected me to just hand over ownership? And why? Because Ben was my brother? Because Mike was dating my mom? When I said no, Mike's entire demeanor changed. It was like he suddenly dropped the act. He started making these weird comments about how unfortunate accidents happen in business all the time. Mentioned that my main warehouse was in a rough part of town. He wasn't even being subtle. He was threatening me. And the worst part? Mom just sat there, nodding along like this was a completely normal conversation. But here's what really shook me. Mike started listing off details about my company, locations that made the most money, delivery schedules, even the names of some of my biggest clients. Information he should have never known. That's when it hit me. Ben had been feeding him everything he remembered from his brief time working for me. They had been plotting this for a while, gathering details, waiting for the right moment to make their move. I pushed my chair back, ready to walk out. This whole thing had gone way too far. Then Mom's voice cut through the tension, calm but sharp. "Sit down. We're not finished here." I shook my head. "Actually, I think we are." Her expression didn't change. "Either you make them partners," she said, pausing just long enough for her words to settle in. "Or not only will I cut you out of this family, but things might get difficult for your business." I froze, staring at her. "Are you serious right now?" Mike leaned back in his chair, smirking. "Look, accidents happen. It'd be real easy for someone to, I don't know, damage one of your delivery trucks. Maybe even start raising concerns about food safety." A sick feeling crept into my stomach. My own mother was sitting there, completely fine with her boyfriend threatening everything I had built. And the most insane part? They acted like they were doing me a favor. "This will be good for you," Mike continued. "I can help modernize things." I nearly laughed. My company already had better technology than any of my competitors. Mom just smiled like she hadn't just helped threaten me. "It'll bring the family together." "Oh, right!" By forcing me to hand over part of my business. My voice was flat, but my fists were clenched under the table. Ben, who had been silent this whole time, just sat there grinning, like he was finally getting what he thought he deserved. I kept my composure, knowing I had to play this differently, so I told them I'd think about it. The look on Mike's face. He really believed he had won. The second I got in my car, I called my lawyer and told him everything. He said we could file a restraining order based on the threats, but proving it would be difficult since they were careful about how they worded everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying my mom's words in my head, trying to figure out how we got here. How did she go from being the woman who worked 3 jobs just to feed us to someone who sat there while her boyfriend threatened her son's livelihood? I knew I had to act fast. The next morning, I called a meeting with my management team and laid everything out. Mike's threats, Ben leaking company information, all of it. These people had been with me for years, some since the very beginning. They deserved to know what was happening. We spent the next 6 hours going through every piece of information Ben might have given them. We changed all our security codes, adjusted delivery routes, shuffled client schedules. I personally called our biggest customers to warn them they might hear some false rumors and made sure to get ahead of any potential damage. Then I took things a step further. I hired extra security, installed new cameras at all locations, and brought in professional guards for the main warehouse. It cost me around $50,000 to put everything in place, but that was a small price to pay compared to what Mike might try to pull. I even installed security cameras and a new system at my own house. Maybe it was paranoia, but better safe than sorry. Then I made one more call to my bank. I canceled every single automatic payment going into Mom's accounts. Mortgage stopped. Car payment stopped. Utilities cut off. Monthly allowance gone. I didn't tell her either. She blindsided me with Mike's threats so she can find out the hard way. With my lawyer's help, I documented everything. We wrote down exactly what was said during that meeting, who was present, and every threat that was made. My management team even provided statements about the security changes we had to make. The security measures we put in place due to the threats might not hold up in court, but at least there was a record of everything. Then, I just waited. I knew it wouldn't take long for Mom to realize something was off, and I was right. About a week later, the messages started rolling in. First, one from the mortgage company saying her payment had been declined. Then, another from the car loan provider. Soon after, her card stopped working because I wasn't transferring money into her account anymore. She kept trying to call me, but I had already blocked her number. Ben started calling from different numbers, but I blocked those too. Then, unbelievably, Mike had the nerve to email my company account, rambling about how I was making a huge mistake and hurting my own mother. I forwarded that straight to my lawyer, just more proof of harassment. Meanwhile, I still had an actual business to run. I was in the middle of negotiating a major contract, working on expanding into 2 new cities and handling the usual daily responsibilities. I couldn't just drop everything because my family decided to act like they were in some low-budget gangster movie. About 2 weeks into this mess, my head of security called me. Someone had tried to break into our main warehouse at around 3 a.m. Nothing showed up on the cameras because they took off when the alarm went off. But guess whose car was spotted in the area? Yep, Mike's. There wasn't enough evidence to prove he was the one trying to get inside, but come on. I filed a police report anyway, though they said there wasn't much they could do without solid proof. Still, I added it to my growing file of documentation. The worst part, through all of this, Mom still acted like I was the one in the wrong. She even got one of her friends to message me on Facebook, saying I was killing her by cutting off the money, that she might lose her house, that I was a terrible son. This is the same woman who sat silently while her boyfriend threatened to ruin my company. And I was the bad guy. Then, other relatives started calling. Funny how they only reach out when they need something. Suddenly, they were all deeply concerned about Mom's well-being, but not one of them offered to help her with her bills. Interesting, right? They had plenty to say about what I should do with my money, but wouldn't spend a cent of their own. About a month after I cut off the payments, I was leaving work late one night, and guess who was waiting in the parking lot? Mom and Ben. For a second, I thought maybe they had come to apologize. Nope. Ben looked ready to throw down, and Mom had that look she used to get right before she started screaming. Right away, Ben got in my face. He looked terrible, skinny and twitchy. Later, I found out he had been involved in some pretty bad stuff, which explained a lot. I, on the other hand, work out 4 to 5 times a week and always make sure to look professional for business. Standing there next to him, we couldn't have looked more different. He started shouting, accusing me of killing Mom, saying she was about to be homeless, that I was picking money over family. I tried to move past him to get to my car, but he kept stepping in my way. Mom just stood there, watching. Didn't even try to calm him down. Then he went for my laptop bag. That bag had my work computer inside, filled with sensitive company information. After everything that happened with Mike trying to get inside knowledge of my business, there was no way I was letting Ben anywhere near it. I yanked the bag back and told him to back off. He lunged again, trying to grab it, so I pushed him away. Not hard, just enough to make space. That's when he actually tried to punch me, like full-on swing at my face. And since I've been training in boxing, that didn't go well for him. I blocked it easily and shoved him back, this time a little harder. He landed on the ground, looking stunned, like he couldn't believe his little brother had actually defended himself. That's when Mom lost it. She started screaming like I had just murdered him, running over to help him up, asking if he was okay. Meanwhile, I stood there with my shirt torn, gripping my laptop bag, wondering how this situation had gotten so completely insane. "I'm calling the cops," I told them. Ben panicked immediately. Turns out, he had outstanding warrants. Something else I found out later. He grabbed Mom, and they ran to their car. I can only imagine how ridiculous the whole scene looked on the security footage. 2 grown men fighting in a parking lot while their mother screamed in the background. Filed another police report, adding it to the ever-growing pile of documentation my lawyer was keeping. Then, the next morning, I had to explain to my employees why the police might be coming around to ask questions. That was fun, trying to maintain a professional image while admitting my own brother had tried to ambush me in the parking lot. For the next few days, everything was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Then, last week, I found out Mike had vanished, with whatever money was left in Mom's accounts. Apparently, he had done this before. People even messaged me, saying he had pulled the same scam with other families. Real piece of work. And then, Ben showed up at my house. This time, he was all cleaned up. New clothes, fresh haircut. I almost didn't answer the door, but figured I'd at least hear what he had to say. Man, what a joke that turned out to be. He started with a sob story, said he was clean now, going to meetings, realizing his mistakes. For a second, I actually felt bad for him. Then, the real reason for his visit came out. He and Mom had cooked up a new plan. They wanted me to loan them money to start their own business. Said they had a huge opportunity but needed startup cash. I asked for details, and surprise, surprise, it was an obvious pyramid scheme. They hadn't changed. They had just found a new way to try and take my money. That was the final straw. I told Ben to get off my property and never come back. He immediately switched to the guilt trip, started talking about how Mom was going to lose her house, how family should stick together. I just laughed and walked inside, then watched on my security cameras as he kicked my mailbox before speeding off. Mom's eviction is set for next week. The only reason I even know is because her one remaining friend who still speaks to me told me. Apparently, she's been showing people old pictures of us as kids, crying about how her ungrateful son abandoned her. Of course, she conveniently leaves out the part where she sat by while her boyfriend threatened me, or how she repeatedly tried to scam me. You know what's crazy? Ever since I cut them off, my business has been thriving. Just last month, I secured 3 major contracts, and next year, we're expanding with 2 more locations. Turns out that removing toxic family drama from your life is actually great for business. Who would have thought? I got remarried last year. Didn't bring it up before because it wasn't relevant. My wife is incredible. She comes from a business-oriented family and actually understands what it takes to build something from the ground up. Her parents treat me like their own son. We're expecting our first child in just a few months. That's what real family looks like. People who uplift and support each other instead of trying to take advantage. Sometimes I think about that kid I used to be, growing up in a filthy apartment filled with roaches, watching Mom juggle multiple jobs. I wanted so badly to give her a better life. And I did. I covered her bills for years, put her in a beautiful home, and sent her money every month. But it was never enough. She and Ben always wanted more. They felt entitled to everything I worked for. Mom and Ben don't know anything about my new life. They have no idea where I live now. I moved to a gated community last year. They don't have my new phone number or email, and my company has strict instructions to never share any details or allow them access to any of our buildings. Do I feel guilty sometimes? Sure. The memories from childhood haven't completely faded. But then I remind myself how they tried to destroy everything I built, how they schemed with Mike to take my company, and how they never once apologized. Instead, they just kept coming up with new ways to get their hands on my money. Appreciate all the support, guys. And no, I'm not telling you what my business is. I've learned my lesson about sharing details with family. LOL. Stop messaging me about helping my mom one last time. Your family might be different, but you don't know mine. Some people will never change.